The evening was filled with glamour, wealth, and the polished shine of people who believed money gave them importance. Inside the grand hall, chandeliers sparkled like captured stars, and laughter echoed among the guests dressed in their finest clothes. At the center of it all was a billionaire, a man used to being admired, feared, and obeyed. His every word seemed to carry weight because of his fortune, and people gathered around him as if he were the only person who mattered. But his arrogance was as big as his fortune. He loved mocking others, especially those he thought were beneath him. Among the workers serving food and cleaning quietly in the background was Marcus, the janitor. He wore a plain uniform, his shoes slightly worn from long hours of work. While most people ignored him, the billionaire noticed him only to turn him into the punchline of a cruel joke. As the music played softly from a hired band, the billionaire spotted the shiny black grand piano in the corner of the room. Its keys glistened under the light, untouched for the evening. With a sly grin, he raised his glass of champagne and said loudly so everyone could hear, "Imagine this janitor playing that piano. If he can play it, I'll marry him." The room burst into laughter, the kind that isn't filled with kindness, but with mockery. People clapped at the joke, some even pointing at Marcus. Making the moment more humiliating, Marcus felt the sting of those words. He had been laughed at before, looked down on, and ignored countless times. But something about this public ridicule cut deeper. The billionaire's challenge wasn't meant to be serious. It was meant to embarrass him, to prove that someone like Marcus had no place among the wealthy, no skill to display, and certainly no reason to be noticed. The laughter continued, bouncing off the golden walls of the hall, but Marcus stood quietly. Inside, however, something was stirring. He remembered the nights of his childhood when he would sit in front of an old broken keyboard that someone had thrown away. He remembered pressing keys that barely worked, teaching himself the language of music without any teacher, without sheet music, just pure determination. He remembered the comfort music gave him during the hardest times when his family struggled to make ends meet. To him, music wasn't just notes. It was survival, hope, and freedom. The billionaire, still smiling smugly, leaned back in his chair, convinced the joke had done its job. But some guests, curious and entertained by the thought of the janitor taking the challenge, began encouraging Marcus. "Go on," one woman teased. "Play us something." Another man added mockingly. The pressure grew heavier, but instead of shrinking back, Marcus felt a spark inside him. He took a slow breath. He had spent years hiding his talent because he knew people wouldn't expect greatness from someone in his position. But tonight, in front of all these people, he realized he had a choice. Either walk away in silence and let them laugh at him, or sit at that piano and show them something they would never forget. The billionaire tapped his glass again, calling for attention. "Well, what are you waiting for?" His voice dripped with sarcasm. "If you can play, then play. Let's see what kind of genius a janitor can be." Marcus looked at the piano. It seemed intimidating under the bright lights, but at the same time, it called to him like an old friend waiting patiently. He knew that behind those keys was the chance to turn humiliation into triumph. His heart pounded, but not from fear. This was the sound of courage. As he walked slowly toward the piano, the crowd parted, whispering and smirking. To them, this was entertainment, a small distraction in their glittering evening. But for Marcus, it was something else entirely. It was the challenge of a lifetime. Not the billionaire's challenge, but his own personal challenge to prove that true talent does not need money, fancy clothes, or approval from the rich. It only needs honesty, passion, and a heart willing to risk everything. The billionaire chuckled, shaking his head, convinced Marcus would embarrass himself and give everyone a good laugh. But Marcus wasn't thinking about the billionaire anymore. He was thinking about the little boy he once was, sitting alone in a small room, dreaming of the day his music would be heard. With each step closer to the piano, the laughter seemed to fade. Marcus wasn't afraid of their ridicule anymore. He knew something they didn't. He wasn't walking toward failure. He was walking toward destiny. Marcus was not born into wealth, nor did he ever dream of living in a mansion like the people he worked for. His story began in a small neighborhood where life was rough and money was always short. His mother worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table, while his father left when Marcus was still a boy. The family had little, but they had love. And his mother's encouragement taught Marcus the importance of dignity and hard work. Yet, it was something else. Marcus had something invisible, something priceless: music. From the time he was a child, he would listen to every sound around him as if it were part of a hidden symphony. The hum of the refrigerator, the drip of water from a leaky tap, the rustling of leaves outside his window. He heard rhythm in everything. Music was always around him, even when there were no instruments, no teachers, no lessons. When Marcus turned 10, he discovered an old broken keyboard that someone had thrown out with the trash. Most of the keys didn't even work, and the plastic casing was cracked, but to Marcus, it was treasure. He carried it home as if it were gold. Every day after school and chores, he sat in front of it and pressed the keys that still worked. He didn't know how to read sheet music, but he had an ear for sound. Slowly, through trial and error, he taught himself chords, melodies, and harmonies. His mother would sometimes come home late at night, exhausted from her shift, only to find Marcus still playing that battered keyboard. Instead of scolding him for staying up, she would smile and say softly, "One day, baby, your music will take you far. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Those words became a promise he carried deep inside his heart. As Marcus grew older, life became harder. Bills piled up, opportunities disappeared, and dreams were buried under the weight of responsibility. He took whatever jobs he could find: cleaning, lifting, fixing. He became a janitor, not because he lacked ambition, but because life demanded survival more than it allowed dreams. Yet even then, he never abandoned music. Whenever he had a free moment, he sought out pianos in churches, community centers, or anywhere he was allowed to play. There was one church in particular that kept its doors open late. Inside stood a slightly out-of-tune upright piano. Marcus would sneak in after work, sit quietly, and let his fingers dance across the keys. No one taught him, no one guided him, but his soul knew the way. He blended classical pieces he had heard on old radios with gospel rhythms he learned from the choir. His style became something unique, pure, raw, and filled with emotion. People who heard him play, even for a few minutes, felt something stir inside them. But Marcus never bragged, never showed off. He was humble, perhaps too humble. He knew the world didn't expect brilliance from a man in a janitor's uniform. People barely looked at him when he mopped the floors or fixed a broken light bulb. To them, he was invisible, just another worker. And Marcus accepted it. Because what mattered most to him wasn't recognition, it was the music itself. Still, there were nights when he would sit alone, wondering if his talent was meant to stay hidden forever. He thought about what life could have been like if he had money for lessons, or if someone powerful had discovered his gift. But then he would remind himself, true talent doesn't wait for permission. It simply exists. And so he played on, in silence, in shadows, while the world walked past him without knowing. By the time Marcus began working in the Billionaire's building, his skills had become extraordinary. Years of practice, pain, and patience had turned him into more than just a pianist. He was an artist. Every key he touched carried the weight of his journey. But no one there knew this side of him. To them, he was just the janitor. And Marcus was fine with that. He wasn't chasing fame. He was chasing peace. He found joy in polishing the floors until they gleamed, in making sure the hallways were spotless, and in doing his job with pride. But deep down, a small part of him wondered if he would ever have the chance to show the world the music living inside him. That chance came unexpectedly, wrapped in cruelty. The billionaire's mocking challenge was not designed to discover talent, it was meant to humiliate him. Yet, without realizing it, the arrogant man had opened the very door Marcus had been waiting for all his life. Marcus didn't see himself as just a janitor. He was a musician in disguise, a genius hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right moment. And now, with the piano shining under the lights and dozens of eyes watching, that moment had finally arrived. The hall was alive with laughter, the kind that echoed sharply against the golden walls and polished marble floors. Guests dressed in glittering gowns and tailored suits clinked glasses, sipping champagne while whispering about the janitor's challenge. The billionaire, sitting comfortably in his leather chair at the center of the room, leaned back with a smug smile, enjoying the spectacle he had created. For him, humiliating someone was a form of entertainment. Marcus stood frozen. Near the back of the hall, he wasn't used to being the center of attention. Normally, he slipped in and out of rooms unnoticed, cleaning quietly while conversations floated past him like distant waves. But now, dozens of eyes were pinned on him. Their expressions weren't kind. They were mocking, expectant, and hungry. For a show? Go on then, janitor. Someone jeered from the crowd, laughter following like a cruel echo. Play us a little tune. Another voice added, maybe he'll sweep the keys instead of playing them. The jokes kept coming, louder, harsher, and the laughter grew. Marcus felt the heat rise in his chest, a mix of shame and anger. He wanted to disappear, but something inside him wouldn't let him move. The billionaire raised his glass again, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Don't be shy now. If you can play this piano, I'll keep my word. I'll marry you. Or maybe, more realistically, we'll all get a good laugh. The guests roared again, the sound filling every corner of the room. Marcus's hands clenched at his sides. He thought about all the times people had underestimated him. When teachers dismissed him because he couldn't afford lessons, when neighbors assumed he'd never become more than a laborer, when life itself seemed to laugh at his dreams. He had endured mockery before, but never like this, never in front of so many people, never with such cruelty. The piano stood in the corner, shining under the chandelier's light. Its polished surface reflected the room like a mirror, but to Marcus, it looked like something else entirely. It looked like opportunity. It looked like a stage calling him forward. He remembered the words of his mother. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. She had believed in him when no one else did. That memory steadied him, like a hand on his shoulder. Still, the ridicule didn't stop. One guest, fanning herself dramatically, said, maybe he only knows how to play the mop. Another man, chuckling loudly, added, if he plays as badly as he cleans, we're in for a disaster. The insults stung, but beneath them, Marcus felt a growing determination. He lifted his head slowly, his eyes scanning the room. The laughter, the smirks, the champagne glasses raised in mock celebration, all of it blurred together. For the first time in years, Marcus didn't feel small. He didn't feel invisible. He felt ready. The billionaire smirked, thinking he had won. To him, Marcus was just another pawn in his game of arrogance, a man who would soon embarrass himself in front of everyone. But Marcus knew something the billionaire didn't. This was not about the challenge anymore. This was about dignity. This was about proving that greatness could live in unexpected places. As Marcus took a slow step toward the piano, the laughter grew louder, almost hysterical, as though the guests couldn't believe he was actually going to try. To them, it was the beginning of a comedy act. To Marcus, it was the beginning of something life-changing. His shoes tapped softly against the marble floor as he walked. Every step seemed to silence a small pocket of laughter until the room began to grow uneasy. The closer he got, the more the piano seemed to glow, waiting for his touch. The voices mocking him faded into background noise, like static on a broken radio. His heart pounded, not from fear, but from a deep sense of destiny. The billionaire called out again, this time louder. Well, janitor, impress us. Let's see what genius hides in those dusty hands of yours. The crowd snickered, waiting for Marcus to crumble. But Marcus didn't flinch. He had heard ridicule all his life. But what people didn't understand was that ridicule had forged him. Every cruel laugh had pushed him back to his music. Every insult had made him practice longer, harder. Every rejection had made him better. The billionaire thought he was setting Marcus up for humiliation. Instead, he had unknowingly prepared him for victory. As Marcus reached the piano, he paused for a moment, running his hand along this smooth, cold surface. He could see his reflection playing uniform, weary eyes, calloused hands. But beyond that reflection, he saw something greater. The musician he had always been, the genius that no one had cared to notice. The room buzzed with anticipation. Some whispered that this was going to be embarrassing. Others leaned forward, eagerly, ready for a disaster they could gossip about later. But Marcus wasn't thinking about them anymore. His mind had gone back to the quiet nights in the church, to the broken keyboard of his childhood, to the promise he had made to himself, that one day his music would be heard. The ridicule had been sharp, cruel, and humiliating. But instead of crushing him, it lit a fire. The billionaire had thrown a challenge wrapped in mockery. And Marcus had accepted it not for the billionaire, not for the guests, but for himself. He pulled the piano bench out slowly, the sound scraping across the floor, cutting through the last waves of laughter. Then he sat down, straightened his back, and placed his fingers gently above the keys. The ridicule was still fresh in his ears, but so was his determination. This was no longer about jokes. This was about truth. And as the room fell into a hush, Marcus prepared to speak the only way he knew how, through music. The grand hall, once buzzing with cruel laughter, had grown strangely quiet. The guests leaned forward in their seats. Champagne glasses paused halfway to their lips. The billionaire rested his chin on his hand, smirking, waiting for the disaster he was certain was about to unfold. The piano sat before Marcus like a great beast, its polished black frame shining under the golden chandelier. It was no longer just an instrument. It was a stage, a test, and a doorway to something far greater than anyone in that room could imagine. Marcus sat on the bench, his back straight, his hands trembling slightly above the keys. He could feel the weight of every stare pressing down on him, waiting, judging. His heart pounded in his chest like a drum, each beat echoing louder than the last. But beneath the nerves was something stronger, resolve. He hadn't come this far to back down. The guests whispered among themselves. "This is ridiculous," one man muttered under his breath. "Just look at him. He's terrified," a woman said with a cruel chuckle. "I bet he doesn't even know which key is middle C," another guest added. Snickering, Marcus closed his eyes, blocking it all out. He wasn't in the hall anymore. He wasn't surrounded by sneers and smirks. In his mind, he was back in his childhood home, sitting in front of that broken keyboard with half its keys missing. He remembered pressing the few that worked, over and over again, until the notes formed into melodies. He remembered how the sound gave him comfort when life was heavy and unfair. That broken keyboard had been his first teacher, his only friend. When the world ignored him, he took a deep breath, inhaling the memory of every late night spent at the church piano. The hours of practice no one had seen, the years of patience and pain. His fingers hovered above the keys, and suddenly the laughter, the whispers, and the smirks faded into silence. The hall seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the moment. And then, with a steady hand, Marcus pressed the first note. The sound rang out, pure and powerful, filling the room like a voice too strong to be ignored. It was not clumsy, not hesitant. It was deliberate, confident, alive. The single note hung in the air, vibrating against the walls, echoing in the silence. For a moment, time itself seemed to pause. The crowd froze. No one laughed. No one whispered. The smirks melted into surprise, the mockery caught in their throats. That single note told them something they hadn't expected. Marcus wasn't a fool. He wasn't here to entertain their cruelty. He was here to show them something real. Marcus felt the weight lift from his chest. That note had been his declaration. His answer to their ridicule. He pressed another key, then another, his hands moving with growing confidence. Slowly, the beginnings of a melody formed, delicate yet commanding. Each note carried a piece of his story, his struggles, his loneliness. His perseverance, the billionaire's smirk, faltered. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. This wasn't what he had expected. He had wanted a spectacle, a failure to laugh at. But what he was hearing now was something else entirely. Marcus's fingers began to glide across the keys, his trembling gone. He no longer thought about the crowd or their laughter. He thought about his mother, who had believed in him when no one else did. He thought about the nights he had played until his fingers ached, dreaming of a day when his music would matter. Every key he pressed was a memory transformed into sound. Every chord a reminder of where he had come from. The melody grew richer, fuller. The notes cascaded like a waterfall, smooth and endless. The room, once filled with mockery, was now filled with awe. Guests sat frozen, eyes wide, their breaths shallow. Some clutched their glasses tighter, others leaned forward. Unable to look away, no one dared to laugh now. As Marcus continued, his music began to take on a life of its own. It wasn't just a performance, it was a story told without words. A confession poured out through sound. The room felt different, almost sacred. As if the piano had become a vessel for something greater than all of them. The billionaire shifted uncomfortably in his seat. For the first time that evening, he wasn't in control. His challenge, meant as a cruel joke, had backfired. The janitor he had ridiculed was commanding the attention of every person in the room. The laughter he had expected had turned into silence, deep, reverent silence. Marcus pressed the keys harder, pouring his heart into the instrument. The music swelled, powerful and emotional, as if years of silence were finally breaking free. His head bowed slightly, his body moving with the rhythm, lost in the music. He wasn't just playing the piano, he was becoming one with it. And then it struck the audience all at once. This wasn't luck. This wasn't some fluke. Marcus wasn't simply good. He was extraordinary. He was a genius hidden in plain sight, a master disguised in a janitor's uniform. By the time he reached the end of his opening melody, the entire room was silent. The only sound was the echo of the last note, fading slowly into the air. The guests who had been so eager to laugh now sat stunned, their eyes wide, their mouths slightly open. They had expected a joke, but what they received was something unforgettable. Marcus lifted his hands from the keys, his heart racing, his chest rising and falling. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't need to. That first note had already spoken for him. The ridicule that had filled the hall only minutes before had vanished, replaced by something new: respect, awe, and the beginning of realization. The janitor had just proven that genius doesn't care about wealth, status, or titles. It lives where it chooses, and tonight it had chosen to reveal itself through Marcus. And this was only the beginning. The final echo of Marcus's opening melody lingered in the air like the last breath of a prayer. The audience sat frozen, unsure whether to clap or to simply stay silent in disbelief. What they had expected to be a moment of embarrassment had turned into something they could not have imagined. The janitor, the man they had mocked just moments before, had touched the piano and changed the entire atmosphere of the room. Marcus lifted his hands again, his eyes still closed, his body calm, but alive with energy. And then he began to play in earnest. This time, the sound poured out of him like a river breaking free from a dam. His fingers danced across the keys, faster, smoother, more precise than anyone thought possible. The notes came not as random sounds, but as an entire world, layered, alive, breathing. It was as if he wasn't just playing music, but telling a story only he could tell. Every rise and fall of the melody spoke of his struggles, his loneliness, his endless practice in silence, the pain of being unseen, the weight of being underestimated. All of it came rushing out through the piano, and yet it wasn't bitter. It wasn't angry. The music soared with hope, with beauty, with the undeniable power of resilience. The guests who had laughed the loudest now sat in stunned silence, their eyes wide, their bodies leaning forward as though pulled closer by an invisible thread. A woman in a sparkling dress covered her mouth, her eyes filling with unexpected tears. A man who had mocked Marcus earlier whispered under his breath, This is impossible." The billionaire, who had once leaned back smugly in his chair, was now sitting upright, his smirk gone. His glass of champagne rested untouched on the table. He couldn't look away, though his pride screamed at him to dismiss what he was hearing. But even he, with all his arrogance, knew the truth. This wasn't luck. This wasn't an accident. This was genius. Marcus's music shifted again, now softer, delicate, like a lullaby. Each note seemed to float through the air and land gently. In the hearts of those listening, the crowd felt it deeply, not just in their ears, but in their souls. His playing carried emotion in its purest form, stripped of words, stripped of barriers. It was as if the piano itself had been waiting for him, and only him, to unlock its voice. The room that had once echoed with cruel laughter now echoed with something entirely different. Reverence? People leaned back slowly, their expressions no longer mocking, but full of awe. Some were moved to tears without understanding why. Others sat motionless, as if afraid to blink and miss a single note. Marcus opened his eyes briefly and glanced at the keys. His reflection stared back at him. In the polished surface of the piano, the janitor uniform, the calloused hands, the tired eyes. But for the first time in his life, he didn't see a man defined by his job or his struggles. He saw an artist. He saw a master. And more importantly, so did everyone else. The music swelled again, powerful and commanding, filling the hall like a storm. It wasn't chaotic. It was controlled, deliberate, and breathtaking. Each chord thundered with authority. Each arpeggio shimmered with brilliance. Marcus was no longer playing for them. He was playing to them, through them, making them feel every emotion he had carried silently for years. Whispers rippled through the audience. Where did he learn this? This is extraordinary. I've never heard anything like it. In my life, the billionaire's face tightened. For the first time, he felt small in his own grand hall. His wealth, his power, his reputation all seemed meaningless compared to the raw talent pouring from the man he had tried to humiliate. He had wanted to expose Marcus as a fool, but instead, Marcus had exposed him as shallow. And still, Marcus played on. His body swayed with the rhythm, his eyes glowing with something fierce and unshakable. It was no longer just about proving himself. It was about reclaiming his dignity, his worth, his identity. Every note was a declaration. I am not invisible. I am not ordinary. I am more than what you see. The genius of his music wasn't only in the complexity of his playing. It was in the way it touched every person in the room differently. For one guest, it brought back childhood memories long forgotten. For another, it felt like forgiveness. For another, it was hope. Marcus wasn't simply showing skill, he was reaching into the deepest parts of people's souls and awakening something they didn't even know was there. By the time Marcus's hands finally slowed, guiding the melody toward its gentle end, the audience had forgotten to breathe. His final notes drifted into silence like stars fading into the dawn. And then nothing. No sound. Just silence. The kind of silence that comes only after witnessing something extraordinary. Marcus lifted his hands from the keys, his chest rising and falling as he exhaled. He didn't bow. He didn't smile. He simply sat there, still and quiet, letting the silence speak for him. And then, slowly, the applause began. It started with a single pair of hands clapping softly, hesitantly, then another, and another. Within seconds, the hall erupted in thunderous applause, louder than any music had been. People stood from their seats, clapping, cheering, shouting his name as if they had always believed in him. But Marcus knew the truth, they hadn't. They were only just now discovering what he had always known. Deep inside, he was more than they thought. The billionaire remained seated, his face pale, his jaw tight. The applause wasn't for him. The power in the room had shifted, and he wasn't the center anymore. The man he had ridiculed had stolen the spotlight, not with wealth or arrogance, but with undeniable genius. And Marcus, the janitor they had once laughed at, had become unforgettable. The thunder of applause filled the grand hall like a tidal wave. It shook the chandeliers, rattled the crystal glasses, and echoed into every corner of the room. People who had been laughing at Marcus only minutes ago were now clapping until their palms turned red, their faces glowed with awe, and some even rose to their feet, giving him a standing ovation. But Marcus didn't move. He remained seated at the piano, his fingers still resting lightly on the keys, his chest rising and falling as he tried to steady his breath. He wasn't used to this being seen, being celebrated. For years, he had poured his soul into music in silence, in hidden places where no one cared to listen. Now suddenly, the very people who mocked him were treating him like a star. Something in the room had changed. It wasn't just the applause. It was the atmosphere, the energy, the collective heartbeat of the audience. They were no longer looking at him as the janitor. They weren't seeing the uniform, the mop, the calloused hands. They were seeing the man behind all of it. The artist, the genius. As the clapping slowly began to fade, a hush fell again. But it was different from before. The first silence had been filled with ridicule, waiting for him to fail. This silence was filled with reverence, waiting for what he might do next. A woman in the front row wiped tears from her cheeks. She hadn't expected to cry that evening. Not in a room of wealth and arrogance, but Marcus's music had unlocked something inside her. She thought of her childhood, of the piano lessons she had once taken but abandoned. The music reminded her of innocence, of dreams left behind. Another man who had spent years building his fortune sat stunned. He had always believed money was power, but what Marcus had done with his bare hands and a piano had shown him a different kind of power. One that couldn't be bought. Even the staff, the waiters, the servers, the other workers who had always stayed in the shadows were watching with pride in their eyes. Marcus was one of them, someone who had carried the same burdens, done the same unseen work. To see him rise above the ridicule and command the room gave them all a sense of victory, as if he were playing for every soul who had ever been overlooked. The billionaire, however, could not hide his discomfort. His smirk had vanished, replaced by a tight jaw and cold eyes. He shifted in his seat as though trying to make himself invisible in his own hall. His challenge, meant to humiliate Marcus, had backfired spectacularly. Instead of a laugh, the guests had been given a revelation. And instead of making Marcus small, he had made him legendary. Marcus finally looked up, his eyes scanning the room. He saw the same people who had ridiculed him moments earlier, now gazing at him with respect, even admiration. Their faces had softened, their expressions humbled. It was strange, almost surreal, to feel the tide turn so quickly. He wasn't angry, though. He wasn't bitter. Instead, he felt a quiet satisfaction. Not because he had proven them wrong, but because he had proven himself right. He had always believed his music meant something, even when no one listened. Tonight, the world had finally heard it. Slowly, Marcus stood from the bench. The audience erupted again, clapping louder, cheering his name. Some even called out, "Bravo!" and "Encore." The shift was complete. He was no longer invisible. But what struck Marcus the most wasn't the applause itself. It was the look in their eyes. Genuine awe. Genuine respect. For the first time, these people saw him not as a janitor, but as a man of worth. As someone who carried a gift greater than their riches. One guest leaned toward another and whispered, "This changes everything. We laughed at him, but he's a genius." The other replied softly, "I'll never forget this night." The billionaire, however, remained silent. He refused to clap, his pride shackling him to his chair. His face was pale, his eyes filled with disbelief. He could not accept what he had just witnessed, because to accept it meant admitting he had been wrong. It meant admitting that all his wealth and arrogance could not measure up to the raw, undeniable brilliance of the man he had tried to mock. The emotional shift spread through the hall like fire. Those who had come for laughter left with humility. Those who thought they were better than Marcus now felt smaller in comparison. Even the piano seemed to shine brighter, as though it knew it had been used for something historic. Marcus didn't bow. He didn't need to. His music had already said everything. Instead, he placed a hand gently on the piano, almost like a farewell touch, and stepped back. The audience continued to applaud, but in Marcus's mind, he heard something else, the quiet voice of his mother. "One day your music will take you far. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." That day had come. He turned toward the crowd, his eyes calm, his presence steady. The billionaire's challenge had been a cruel joke, but Marcus had transformed it into a moment of truth, a moment that none of them would ever forget. The janitor had walked into the room, invisible. He was leaving unforgettable, and though he stood in the same uniform, with the same calloused hands, nothing about him felt the same anymore. He had revealed not just his genius, but a lesson for everyone watching. Greatness does not wear a uniform, nor does it bow to wealth. It lives in the heart, waiting for the moment to rise. The emotional shift was complete. The laughter that once mocked him had been replaced by applause that honored him. And the story of that night was only just beginning. The final note of Marcus's masterpiece still seemed to linger in the golden hall, though his hands had already lifted from the keys. For a few seconds, the room was drowned in silence, as if everyone was too stunned to even breathe. Then, slowly. At first, a few hesitant claps began. They echoed awkwardly in the vast chamber until suddenly the hesitation broke. And applause thundered like a storm. The guests rose from their seats, one after another, clapping, cheering, and shouting words they never imagined they'd say to a janitor. "Bravo!" One man yelled, his voice cracking with emotion. "Magnificent!" cried a woman who had earlier sneered at him. The sound of approval swelled until it was deafening, shaking the very floor beneath Marcus's feet. But Marcus didn't Smiled, didn't boast, didn't bow dramatically like the great performers on stage. He simply stood quietly, hands by his sides, his face calm, his presence steady. He wasn't playing for recognition. He wasn't playing for applause. He had played for something deeper, for dignity, for truth, for the boy inside him who had dreamed of being heard. The audience's reaction was mixed with awe and shame. Those who had laughed the loudest earlier now found themselves unable to meet his eyes. Their faces flushed with guilt, realizing how cruel they had been. A woman in pearls who had mocked him before now clapped with tears streaming down her cheeks, as though her applause could erase her ridicule. Others avoided his gaze completely, their pride shattered. One man leaned over to his wife and whispered, "I can't believe I laughed at him. Did you hear that? That wasn't just talent. That was genius." His wife nodded, her face pale. "He's better than anyone I've ever heard. Better than the pianists we pay fortunes to see. And he's been here, right under our noses, invisible to us all." The waitstaff, too, stood in quiet triumph. They clapped harder than anyone else, their eyes shining with pride. Marcus was one of them, someone who scrubbed, polished, and worked without recognition. And tonight, he had carried all of them onto that stage with him. His victory was theirs too. But amid the roaring applause, one figure sat frozen, the billionaire. His face was tight, his jaw clenched, his fingers drumming nervously against the armrest of his chair. He refused to clap. He refused to stand. To do so would mean admitting he had been wrong, admitting the man he had mocked so arrogantly had outshone him in every possible way. His eyes narrowed as he watched Marcus, but the look of superiority was gone. What replaced it was something else, something he had not felt in years. Fear. Fear of being humbled. Fear of losing control. Fear that all his money and power could not command the kind of respect Marcus had just earned with nothing but a pair of hands and a piano. Marcus, however, wasn't looking at him. He didn't need to. The billionaire's silence spoke louder than any applause. Marcus had won, and he hadn't needed to gloat. His music had already delivered the victory. The guests continued clapping, some shouting, "Encore! Encore!" They wanted more. They weren't ready for it to end. But Marcus simply gave a small nod of gratitude and stepped away from the piano. He didn't need to prove anything more. His point had been made, his genius revealed. As he walked toward the edge of the room, the crowd parted for him, the same crowd that had once mocked him. Now moving aside with respect, their eyes followed him, some filled with admiration, others with guilt. Not one person dared to laugh anymore. The billionaire shifted in his seat, forcing a stiff smile as though pretending to enjoy the show. But everyone could see the truth. He had been defeated in his own hall. The man he thought he could ridicule had stolen the evening, stolen the spotlight, and, in many ways, stolen their hearts. Marcus passed the other staff members, who smiled at him with tears in their eyes. One of them whispered, "You showed them, brother. You showed them all." He nodded quietly, his heart heavy but proud. The reaction wasn't just about applause, was about transformation. The people who had entered the room filled with arrogance and prejudice were leaving humbled and changed. They had been given a lesson, no lecture, no book. No fortune could teach them. Greatness is not bound by status, wealth, or appearance. The billionaire, sitting stiffly, felt the eyes of his guests shift toward him. They weren't looking at him with admiration anymore. They weren't hanging on his words or laughing at his jokes. Their attention, their respect, their admiration had moved entirely to Marcus. The balance of power in that room had shifted completely, and he could do nothing to stop it. Marcus didn't need their money. He didn't need their pity. He had given them something more valuable than either: truth and the truth had struck them harder than any insult ever could. As the applause slowly died down, a heavy silence remained. But this silence wasn't awkward. It wasn't mocking. It was filled with respect, filled with awe. People would remember this moment for the rest of their lives. They would tell the story again and again. Of the night a janitor sat at a piano and revealed himself to be a genius. The billionaire had started the evening with a cruel challenge. If this janitor can play, I'll marry him. It had been a joke, a weapon meant to humiliate. But now, no one was laughing. The joke was on him, and the entire room knew it. Marcus walked quietly toward the back of the hall, leaving behind an audience forever changed. Their reaction had been loud, emotional, overwhelming, but inside each of them, a deeper reaction stirred. Humility, they had been shown, with undeniable brilliance. That genius does not need wealth to shine. And Marcus, without a word, had become unforgettable. The applause eventually faded, but the memory of the music lingered in the hearts of everyone who had heard it. The grand hall, once filled with cruel laughter, now felt transformed. The chandeliers still sparkled. The champagne still bubbled in its glasses, but the atmosphere had changed entirely. It no longer felt like a room of wealth and arrogance. It felt like a room that had witnessed something historic, something unforgettable. Marcus stood near the back now, away from the piano, his presence calm, his uniform unchanged. He was still the janitor, still the man who cleaned their floors. Yet not one person in that room could look at him the same way again. The uniform no longer defined him. The mop, the broom, the bucket, those things had never held the truth of who he was. The piano had revealed the man within, and no amount of ridicule could ever erase that truth. Guests whispered to each other in hushed tones, their voices full of wonder and regret. How could we not see it? One woman said softly, all. This time, he was right here. Another man shook his head. It's shameful. We mocked him, and he is greater than all of us combined. The lesson was spreading, though none of them said it directly. In their hearts, they knew. They had judged a man by his job, his clothes, his station in life. They had assumed worth could be measured in dollars, in titles, in appearances. But Marcus had shattered that illusion with nothing but his bare hands and his music. The staff who worked alongside Marcus stood taller that night. They looked at him not just as a coworker, but as a hero. He had given them hope, proof that their worth was not invisible, that their talents, their dreams, their dignity mattered. He had carried their silent struggles into that performance and turned them into something beautiful. The billionaire, however, remained seated in silence, his pride a heavy chain around his neck. His smirk was gone, replaced by an expression. He could not hide defeat. He had built his life on power, on control, on the ability to humiliate others to prove his superiority. And yet tonight, in his own hall, at his own party, he had been stripped of all that. A man he had thought worthless had humbled him without a single insult, without a single boast, with music. For the first time, the billionaire felt small. And though he would never admit it aloud, he knew the truth. Money could not buy what Marcus had. Wealth could not command genius. Status could not silence truth. Marcus, meanwhile, felt none of the bitterness that might have been expected. He did not gloat, did not glare at the man who had mocked him. Instead, he simply stood with quiet dignity, as if the applause, the admiration. The shift in the room was not a victory over the billionaire, but a victory over something larger. The years of invisibility, the years of being underestimated, the years of carrying genius in silence. He knew then that his music had done what he always dreamed it would. It had spoken for him. It had told the world who he truly was. The lesson of that night would not be written in newspapers or carved into history books, but it would live in the memories of those who had been there. The wealthy guests who had once looked down on Marcus would forever remember the night a janitor played like a maestro and made them question everything they thought they knew about worth. Some would change because of it. They would look at people differently, with less arrogance, with more humility. They would remember that greatness often hides in the most unexpected places. Others would try to forget their pride, too strong to let them accept the truth. But deep down, even they would never erase the memory of the music that had silenced their laughter. For Marcus, the lesson was something he had always carried, but had now proven: true genius does not beg for recognition. It shines when it must, in its own time, in its own way. He didn't need fame. He didn't need fortune. He didn't need the approval of the rich. He needed only his gift and the courage to use it when the moment called. As the night drew to a close, the piano still stood in the corner, quiet but glowing with the memory of what had just happened. The hall emptied slowly, guests leaving with hushed voices, still shaken by what they had witnessed. The billionaire slipped away quietly, his head bowed, his pride wounded. Marcus stayed behind a moment longer, walking back to the piano. He placed his hand gently on its smooth surface, almost like thanking an old friend. For years, music had been his secret companion, his escape, his truth. Tonight, it had also been his voice. He whispered softly, almost to himself, "We showed them." And then he turned and left, not as a janitor, not as a worker, but as a man who had finally been seen for who he truly was. The lesson of that night would ripple outward like a stone cast into water. People would share the story, the tale of a billionaire's cruel challenge, the laughter of the wealthy and the janitor who silenced them all with genius. They would tell it not just as entertainment, but as a warning, as inspiration, as proof that the world is full of hidden brilliance waiting to be discovered, and long after the applause had faded, long after the guests had gone home, long after the billionaire had buried his humiliation in silence, the truth would remain. Greatness cannot be mocked. Talent cannot be silenced. Genius does not need wealth to shine. That night, Marcus had not only played the piano, he had played the hearts of everyone in the room. And in doing so, he taught them all a lesson they would never forget. Never underestimate a man simply because of where he stands. Because sometimes the janitor is the genius.